This meme came across my desk this morning, and by synchronicity, it also is included in the first essay of Jung's Red Book for Our Time. So I thought I would read the accompanying material first. Not the opinion of any individual contemporary will decide the truth and error of what has been discovered, but rather future generations and destiny. There are things that are not yet true today. Perhaps we are not yet permitted to recognize them as true, although they may be true tomorrow. Therefore, every pioneer must take his own path, alone but hopeful, with the open eyes of one who is conscious of its solitude and of the perils of its dim precipices. Our age is seeking a new spring of life. I found one and drank of it, and the water tasted good. That is all that I can and want to say. My intention and my duty to society is fulfilled when I have described, as well as I can, the way that led me to the spring. The reproaches of those who do not follow this way have never troubled me, nor ever will. C.G. Jung, from Collected Papers on Analytical Psychology, pages 443 and 444. Today I'm going to read from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arzt, Volume 1. This is a 3-volume series. The first 2 volumes have been published, and they include 36 essays by Jungian analysts discussing the Red Book from different points of view. The very first of these essays is by one of the editors, Dr. Thomas Arzt. Dr. Arzt is not a clinical psychologist, he's a physicist, but he took on this monumental task and is editing these 50 essays. The 3rd volume is expected out later this year. A year ago, I received my copy of the 1st volume, published by Chiron Publications, and I was really profoundly moved by the first essay in this Volume 1, which is by Thomas Arzt himself. So I'm going to read that today. I have read it in parts over about a year ago or 9 months ago, but today I'm going to read it end to end. And it begins with a part of the quote that I just read to you. Our age is seeking a new spring of life. I found one and drank of it, and the water tasted good. C.G. Jung. Better turn on my lights just a moment. Okay, that's more like it. So I'm reading from the first essay in Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arzt, Volume 1. I was, about 9 months ago, very moved, profoundly moved, by the essay by Thomas Arzt, which is the first of 50 essays in this 3-volume series. So I'm going to read it today with the permission of the author. He begins with a quote from C.G. Jung. Our age is seeking a new spring of life. I found one and drank of it, and the water tasted good. C.G. Jung. A specter haunts our world today. Its name is angst. Small wonder. As former German Secretary of State Frank-Walter Steinmeier recently remarked, the world is out of joint. At the same time, German diplomats such as Wolfgang Ischinger have noted that the disintegration of international security structures has accelerated and that decision makers in politics and business are overrun by unexpected events on a daily basis. Diagnosticians of our times, like German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, see the world plunging forward. The World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report 2017 identifies a hazardous planetary risk landscape that does not invite for much cheerfulness and serenity. Our present age, which we may call postmodernity, is characterized by an overwhelming amount of fluidity and volatility on a global scale, as well as on the level of everyday lives of individuals. Cynical contemporaries even speak of a racing standstill. Although nothing remains the same, nothing substantial does in fact change, even if we cannot yet see the direction in which this unbridled fast train engine called globalization will take us. Today's world is obviously undergoing historic transformations that are probably unique in size and scale. Pourvu que cela dure. If only this will work out well in the long run, as Napoleon's mother remarked while witnessing the coronation of her son. Let me just point out that this is a behind-the-scenes reading, so I may read outtakes, and occasionally I will stop to respond to chats. This video will be edited probably within the next week. But I must turn off my cell phone, that is for sure, because it is driving me crazy. Okay. The Grenade makes a comment in the chat. For a second, I thought that the title said "Searching for Soul Under Postmortem Conditions." Well, we're not quite to postmortem yet, but we're getting there. Okay, so I'm carrying on after Napoleon's mother here. In fact, there have always been turbulent thrusts, cracks, faults, and societal feverish states. Contemporary historians usually attribute these to exclusively. Contemporary historians usually attribute these to exclusively. Contemporary historians usually attribute these two exclusively to technological change and innovation. For example, if we consider the decade prior to the year 1914, as Philip Blum's work, The Vertigo Years, Change and Culture in the West, 1900 to 1914, impressively shows, we find that the first 14 years of the 20th century saw rapid socio-economic developments that put the individuals, as well as many European societies, into a highly agitated state. The spirit of this time, as C.G. Jung referred to it in his Red Book, then led Europeans, as though sleepwalking, to exhausting trench warfare and technological mobilization, giving rise to geopolitical realignments. What is disconcerting is Blum's observation, quote, "Then as now, rapid changes in technology, globalization, communication technologies, and changes in the social fabric dominated conversations and newspaper articles. Then as now, cultures of mass consumption stamped their mark on the time. Then as now, the feeling of living in an accelerating world of speeding into the unknown was overwhelming, unquote. The tremors of World War I consequently led to World War II. In our time, total mobilization has reached the planetary level. Just one spiral turn higher. Once more, we are disoriented in an epoch of angst. And now, 100 years after the age of anxiety, we find ourselves again restless in the age of burnout. Artists and sensitive contemporaries who lived between the years 1880 and 1914, such as the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, intuited the seismographic shift that was about to come. Bewildered by societal developments and generational world weariness, trapped in the prison of reason and yearning for an absent meaning, the best minds look for new ways out of the spiritual malaise of their time. Dadaist Hugo Ball described the collective condition of his generation as follows. The world and society in 1913 looked like this. Life is completely confined and shackled. A kind of economic fatalism prevails. Each individual, whether he insists on it or not, is assigned a special role, and with it his interests and his character. The church is regarded as a redemption factory of little importance, literature as a safety valve. The most burning question day and night is there anywhere a force that is strong enough to put an end to this state of affairs? And if not, how can one escape it? Unquote. God is dead, as Nietzsche announced, and the iron cage of modernity was, in the meantime, having turned into an omnipresent digitalized gestalt rigidly established. Contemporaries sensed the severe implications of the erosion of the Christian myth, not to be at home in one's own time anymore. Then, as now, the collective situation forced the search for transcendence and meaning in order to withstand the undertow of the postmodern chaos that has undoubtedly revealed a nihilistic signature. The Swiss psychologist C.G. Jung undertook perhaps the most challenging deep dive to seek. The Swiss psychologist C.G. Jung undertook perhaps the most challenging deep dive to seek answers to the questions posed by the epoch. Alarmed by visions and dreams which reflected the tensions of his era and presaged the coming world war, Jung daringly searched for his soul in an experiment to learn his personal myth. After the descent, Jung not only formulated his own myth, but was also able to suggest the framework for a new collective myth. As will be illustrated later, Jung's Red Book, Liber Novus, is both a highly intimate testimonial and a reference to the framework of this new collective myth. Even though the term postmodernity is difficult to define and contains a high degree of ambiguity due to its notorious lack of conceptual clarity, attempts at diagnostic analysis have shown several general characteristics. such as a deconstructionism, radical plurality, arbitrariness, liquidity, fragmentation, decanonization, acceleration, muddling through, increase in complexity, ambiguity, and slippery slopes. In a few sentences, German writer Hans Magnus Enzensberger masterfully portrays our contemporary postmodern condition in which the increase of entropy can even be witnessed right in our own backyards. Quote, Lower Bavarian market towns, rural villages in the Eifel, small towns in Holstein are populating themselves with figures that nobody would have considered imaginable just 30 years ago. Golf-playing butchers, wives imported from Thailand, undercover intelligence officers in allotment gardens, Turkish mullahs, female pharmacists in Nicaragua committees, Mercedes-Benz driving vagabonds, anti-authoritarians with organic gardens, gun-collecting tax officers, farmers breeding peacocks, militant lesbians, Tamil ice cream vendors, classical philologists trading commodities futures, mercenaries on home leave, extremist animal rights activists, cocaine dealers with tanning salons, dominatrices with customers from top management, computer freaks commuting between Californian databases and Hessian wildlife reserve parks, carpenters delivering doors made of gold to Saudi Arabia, art forgers, Karl May scholars, bodyguards, jazz experts, palliative care physicians, and porn producers, the loners and village idiots, weirdos, and misfits all have been replaced by the mediocre deviant who does not even stick out anymore among the millions of his ilk. Unquote. Wow. I guess that sort of sums it up. Going on. In one important aspect, and this is the essential point with regard to Jung's Red Book, the diagnoses of our time appear to converge. There is, according to French philosopher and sociologist Jean-François Lyotard, himself a disappointed Marxist by his own admission, no major, meaningful, and integrative meta-narrative anymore. No grand narrative that is able to impart an all-encompassing conception of humankind's role in the world. For any grand narrative, such as is offered, for example, by the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Bible, the Odyssey, the Enlightenment, the belief in science or Marxism, the following postmodern analysis applies. Quote, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. This incredulity is undoubtedly a product of progress in the sciences, but that progress in turn presupposes it. To the obsolescence of the meta-narrative apparatus of legitimation corresponds most notably the crisis of metaphysical philosophy and of the university institution which in the past relied on it. The narrative function is losing its functors, its great hero, its great dangers, its great voyages, its great goal. It is being dispersed in clouds of narrative language, narrative but also denotative, prescriptive, descriptive, and so on. Conveyed within each cloud are pragmatic valences. Conveyed within each cloud are pragmatic valencies specific to its kind. Each of us lives at the intersection of many of these. From a spiritual point of view, unquote. From a spiritual point of view, the horizon of meaning offered by a divine order, the great order of being, is seemingly lost, while from the perspective of the postmodern subject, the world as well as life itself is not readable, understandable, or shapeable anymore. Whereas prior epics had a meaningful grand narrative, here Dante's Divine Comedy, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, and Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra come to mind. The modern or postmodern man is left without a timely, central, and vivid myth. The modern or postmodern man is left without a timely, central, and vivid myth. In Edward Edinger's estimation, this condition of spiritual and metaphysical homelessness, a state of being perhaps best captured by Nietzsche's Last Man or Martin Heidegger's They, has only deepened in later times. Quote, "It is evident to thoughtful people that Western society," "It is evident to thoughtful people that Western society no longer has a viable, functioning myth. Indeed, all major world cultures are approaching, to a greater or lesser extent, the state of mythlessness. The breakdown of a central myth is like the shattering of a vessel containing a precious essence. Meaning is lost." Okay, I'll take a break just for a minute and see what you're saying. Student of Rhythm says, "This part reminds me of the Nick Cave song, God is in the House." And Sam Studer says, "What will our new myth be?" Well, Sam, I think that in terms of Jung's overall oeuvre, and that all came after the Red Book period, Dr. Jung's belief is that the new myth will come from the individual and not from belief in a belief system like Christianity or Islam or Judaism or whatever, but we will all have to create our own myths. And so Dr. Jung certainly created his own myth. Referring back to Jung's work, Edinger continues, "As Jung's discovery of his own mythlessness paralleled the mythless condition of modern society, so Jung's discovery of his own individual myth will prove to be the first emergence of our new collective myth." Okay, so as I said, okay. Edinger's statement is only understandable if one puts aside the discourse of academic sociologists, cultural theorists, and professional philosophers. opening up to the sphere of individual core experience, Kernerfahrung, in the sense of Carl Fried Graf Durkheim, or Jung's experience of the self. One approaches the psychological, religious, spiritual, and metaphysical realms of life that are generally thought to be off limits by today's postmodern academic establishment. Nothing causes greater tedium and disregards the central questions of our time more than the ignorance and prevailing bustle witnessed within the self-referential and detail-obsessed chairs of our university institutions. In all likelihood, nothing revelatory will come from their discourse. I'm sorry. Thomas is really telling it like it is here. In all likelihood, nothing revelatory will come from their discourse. Let's see. Grenade says, Elon Musk thinks we are living in a simulation. It's basically a meme now. The myth keeps changing. Student of rhythm, that simulation idea could make a good myth, like the Hindu idea of Maya, really, but there's a danger of it staying stuck in apathy. Grenade says, well, simulation is the best word we have for it. It is the same exact idea as the allegory of the cave by Plato. Student of rhythm, oh, burn on the university. Spot on, though. And student of rhythm, Grenade, true. Okay, so reading on. It might be this near universal bypassing of the central questions of our present age that is globally driving an increasing interest in Jung. The 21st century could be Jung's century, a century in which a postmodern state of mind and the demise of the secular conception of the human stimulates the intense search for sustainable alternatives to an epoch dominated by positivism, materialism, reductionism, and atheism. After all, in a spell of pneumophobia, modernity's dethronement of déraison led to an oppression of all phenomena of the spirit or the sacred. Subsequently, the spirit, as well as the anima mundi, according to Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli, has disappeared into the unconscious. Jung described this process in The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man as follows, quote, whenever there exists some external form, be it an ideal or a ritual, by which all the yearnings and hopes of the soul are adequately expressed, as for instance in a living religion, then we may say that the psyche is outside and that there is no psychic problem, just as there is no unconscious in our sense of the word. The consonance with this truth, the discovery of psychology, falls entirely within the last decades, although long before that, man was introspective and intelligent enough to recognize the facts that are the subject matter of psychology. So also, a spiritual need has produced in our time the discovery of psychology. The psychic facts still existed earlier, of course, but they did not attract attention. No one noticed them. People got along without them. But today we can no longer get along unless we pay attention to the psyche. D'où se retire Nonetheless, one has to follow God, according to the view of German writer Ernst Jünger. Du se retire. Nonetheless, one has to follow God, according to the view of German writer Ernst Jünger. Hence, the engagement with the unconscious becomes a vital necessity, not only for the individual, but for the social collective, since it has become a matter of survival. Ironically, the historic moment of the proclamation of the iron cage by sociologist and philosopher Max Weber coincided with the beginning of depth psychology, perhaps an unexpected cunning of reason. From the perspective of Jung's understanding of the evolution of human consciousness, the project of maternity could only lead to the darkening of the world. As Heidegger said, quote, "For all ages before us have believed in gods in some form or other. Only an unparalleled impoverishment of symbolism could enable us to rediscover the gods as psychic factors, that is, as archetypes of the unconscious. Since the stars have fallen from heaven and our highest symbols have paled, a secret life holds sway in the unconscious. That is why we have a psychology today and why we speak of the unconscious. All this would be quite superfluous in an age of cult. All of this would be quite superfluous. Sorry. All of this would be quite superfluous in an age or culture that possessed symbols. Symbols are spirit from above, and under those conditions the spirit is above too. Therefore, it would be a foolish and senseless undertaking for such people to wish to experience or investigate an unconscious that contains nothing but the silent, undisturbed sway of nature. Our unconscious, on the other hand, hides living water, spirit that has become nature, and that is why it is disturbed. Heaven has become for us the cosmic space of the physicists, and the divine empyrean, a fair memory of things that once were. But the heart glows, and a secret unrest gnaws at the roots of our being." Unquote. Let's see. Student of Rhythm says, "Numiphobia. That's a very apt diagnosis." Sam Studer, "Would the collective nature of the psyche prevent each individual's new myth from spinning into radical subjectivism?" I think that's a fair question, Sam. I would have to say that the collective nature of the psyche and the collective unconscious does prevent the extremes. I mean, you may doubt that watching American political history evolve in 2018, but nonetheless, it seems that the out-of-bounds stuff is being controlled. Julie Westament says, "Good evening, Skip. First live reading I've caught in a while. I've been catching up on your other readings. What are you doing? What you are doing is amazing and much appreciated." You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, reading on. So I'm reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arzt. I'm reading from the very first essay of the first volume, which is by Thomas Arzt, Dr. Thomas Arzt, and I would say I'm about a third of the way through this essay at this point. There's some really rock'em sock'em bits later on here. The spirit is waiting in the collective unconscious for recognition, for integration into the collective unconscious of our postmodern times. Today, the spirit is knocking at our door, or as Junger put it, the primordial essence is alive. Many pathologies of our age emerge from the lack of having an alchemical vessel to integrate these archetypal spiritual energies into the socio-cultural context. If the individual or society denies these energies the chance for expression, if the individual or society denies these energies the chance for expression, they will turn to confusion, destruction, and violence. Mercurius duplex. It was alchemy that found the adequate expression for this, good with the good and bad with the bad. For the time being, though, it remains a mystery how the oversaturated, overaged, and overaged, and overregulated societies of the West, run by disoriented and unimaginative guardians of the status quo in politics, media, and business, should approach this monumental challenge. We are devoid of any vision for the future. The best lack, quote, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passion. The best, quote, this is a quote from famous William Butler Yeats's famous poem, quote, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity, lamented William Butler Yeats during Jung's day. Meanwhile, much would be gained if the planetary turbulences of postmodernity could be interpreted as a pregnant phase of initiation, as a rite de passage. Sorry, my French isn't quite up to snuff for pronunciation, and my German is non-existent, but anyway, let me try again. As a rite de passage. In this sense, future generations would be inclined retrospectively to understand our postmodern era as a phase of negredo, as a time of collective disorientation and confusion, with its attitude toward the world manically oscillating between a Baroque lust for life and an apocalyptic foreboding of death. From Jung's perspective, it is important, though, to face the insecurity and abyss of postmodern life and to accept our spiritual nakedness, and to accept our spiritual nakedness as well as the obvious dissolution of traditional belief systems, and openness to the psyche so that its intimidations can be consciously realized is crucial too. Further, we have to learn how to deal with existential insecurity, uncertainty, and ambivalence, because at the center of anxiety, something may want to speak to us. If we are in a state of darkness, it is divine darkness. If we feel ourselves to be stuck in a state of void, it is a divine void. In a similar point of view, German philosopher Leopold Ziegler considers the state of Western this is a German word which I cannot pronounce, Signs Virgus and height. I'm going to just read the translation of the word here. German philosopher Leopold Ziegler considers the state of Western forgetting of being a gestalt of a divine being in absconditus, Within the metaphysical loneliness of modern consciousness, Jung detects a divine providence, or rather an occasion for a renewed experience of spirituality, especially as the living spirit attempts to resurrect from the ruins of the Christian edifice of beliefs. In this sense, the deconstruction frenzy of the 20th century would be understandable, as Richard Tarnas has pointed out. Quote, "The 20th century's massive and radical breakdown of so many structures, cultural, philosophical, scientific, religious, moral, artistic, social, economic, political, atomic, ecological, all this suggests a necessary deconstruction prior to a new birth," unquote. If Tarnas has it right, coming generations, hopefully, might perhaps look back one day also on a phase of rubedo. Coming generations, hopefully, might perhaps look back one day also on a phase of rubedo, the emergence of a new post-Christian spirituality. Now, I'll just say as an aside, the terms negredo and rubedo come from alchemical symbolism, which is an entirely different subject, but you can look them up on Wikipedia, I presume, or look up the phases of alchemy, and you then will understand negredo and rubedo. And these are also terms that are used among Jungian analysts to relate to individual analysis. However, in this case, Dr. Arzt is using them with respect to society as a whole. So, reading on. How to continue now? We are currently living in a historic moment in which all aspects of human existence have to be reconceived and radically put to the test with respect to the secret life of the living spirit. Support may be offered by Jung's psychological law of energy conservation, stating that if anything of importance is devalued in our conscious life and perishes, so runs the law, there arises a compensation in the unconscious. What Jung is saying is that if the archetypal world of spirit gets ignored by a purely materialistic worldview for too long, the former will be subsequently activated with a proportionally high energetic value in the collective unconscious. Even for the simple-minded, this should be plausible insofar as the religious impulses of the soul, anima naturaliter religiosa, cannot merely vanish into thin air. Rather, it will be forced to change locations due to the overdose of modern rationality. Quote, "It may be possible to suppress them, but it cannot alter their nature. And what is suppressed comes up again in another place in altered form, this time loaded with a resentment that makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy." Unquote. Since the archetypal world cannot be suppressed without substantial consequences, and since contemporary society and culture are not able to tackle the actual problems, let alone draw up feasible solutions. It is the individual that ultimately has to face this conflict. Sensible, sensitive, even deranged contemporaries once again have to restore the spiritual anchorage that has been undercut by postmodern categories of interpretation, leading to the ensuing psychological crisis. The challenge today, therefore, is on the one hand not to discard our Christian tradition and heritage, and on the other hand to face up to the state of negredo into which we have descended. In Jung's view, we are standing at the beginning of a new psychological culture. Sorry, that sentence split in mid in turning the page, so I'm going to reread it. In Jung's view, we are standing at the beginning of a new psychological culture and era, one still, however, without collective guiding images, symbols, rituals, and myths. Entering uncharted territory within this new culture goes hand in hand with the following prerequisite developments already underway. New integration efforts concerning the inclusion of evil within the understanding of wholeness, as well as the unsightly and banal, integration of the feminine and nature as significant dimensions repressed and neglected by Christianity. Reinterpretation of religious scriptures as poetic and symbolic rather than as purely historical and literal. Reinterpretation of the figure of Christ as a symbolic expression of the inner dynamics of the soul. At this point, it seems clear that under postmodern conditions, only one path forward remains passable. If we have interpreted the signs of our time correctly, the metamorphosis of the gods will require the individual's utmost commitment to an ongoing process for which Jung proposed the term individuation. The narrative for this is contained in the Red Book, and with it begins Jung's new myth showing, quote, the way of what is to come, unquote. Thank you for joining me for this reading today. I'm reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arzt. This is Volume 1 of the 3-volume series. My soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak. I call you. Are you there? On November 12th, 1913, Jung began his inner work on what would eventually become his Red Book. This dramatic passage occurs in the chapter titled Refinding the Soul. In a preliminary remark, Jung had noted that he had been able to obtain honor. In a preliminary remark, Jung had noted that he had been able to attain honor, power, wealth, knowledge, and every human happiness, while distress in his inner and the outer worlds had overcome him with horror. Given his break with Sigmund Freud and the resulting state of questioning his previous understanding of the psyche, Jung's distress becomes understandable. Weighing heavily also was a series of remarkable dreams, visions, and waking fantasies that left him bewildered to the point of suspecting an impending psychosis. Slowly, however, Jung began to realize that, for instance, his waking fantasies in October 1913, in which Europe was flood-ravaged, described in precognitive form events that were about to happen, not uniquely to him, but to Europe. Let's try that. That's a long sentence. Slowly, however, Jung began to realize that, for instance, his waking fantasies in October 1913, in which Europe was flood-ravaged, described in precognitive form events that were about to happen not uniquely to him, but to Europe collectively with the outbreak of World War I. Within this personal, highly disturbed state of mind, and within the catastrophic world situation, something else that had already bothered Jung after putting the finishing touches on the title of this book in German is Wandlungen und Symbol der Libido, but I'm going to read it as Symbols of Transformation, which is the later name, although it was at that time, it was in 1912, published in English at least, or I guess it was in 1916. It was published in English under the name Psychology of the Unconscious. So I'm going to reread that sentence once again, or the end of that sentence. Something else that had already bothered Jung after putting the finishing touches on Symbols of Transformation again became painfully evident to him, namely that a man who thinks he can live without myth or outside it is an exception. He is like one uprooted, having no true link either with the past or with the ancestral life which continues within him, or yet with contemporary human society. Then, stating his own personal dilemma, he continues, quote, I was driven to ask myself in all seriousness, quote, I was driven to ask myself in all seriousness, what is the myth you are living? I found no answer to this question and had to admit that I was not living with a myth or even in a myth, but rather in an uncertain cloud of theoretical possibilities, which I was beginning to regard with increasing distrust. I did not know that I was living a myth, and if I had known it, I would not have known what sort of myth was ordering my life without my knowledge. So, in the most natural way, I took it upon myself to get to know my myth, and I regarded this as the task of tasks. For, so I told myself, how could I, when treating my patients, make due allowance for the personal factor, for my own personal equation, which is yet so necessary for a knowledge of the other person, if I was unconscious of it? I simply had to know what unconscious or preconscious myth was forming me, from what rhizome I sprang, unquote. And so, in November 1913, during an experiment of self-discovery, my most difficult experiment, Jung embarked on a search for his own myth. This search would lead him to a new spring of life, about which he would later write to Victor White, quote, I wanted the proof of a living spirit, and I got it. Don't ask me at what price, unquote. Initially, Jung wrote down his fantasies and active imaginations in the so-called black books, which are regarded as a personal protocol of his self-experiment. From there, they found their way into a red leather-bound folio volume. From there, they found their way into a red leather-bound folio volume, for which he revised the material while also enhancing it with commentary and carefully drawn and meticulously arranged pictures. If you're not familiar with it, I happen to have the 2009 published version of Liber Novus, which is a huge volume. I can't get far enough away from the camera to show you, but in the first couple of hundred pages is written in German calligraphy in Jung's own hand, and like a European manuscript, there are many illuminations, and there are also many actual paintings that are quite remarkable, like this painting as an example. I just opened at random. So this is the Red Book in the folio version. It's available now from Amazon for something like $150, and it has in the back, everything is in English. Now, if you don't have $150 to buy the folio version, which for me was a gift from my wife for Christmas, you can, for about $25, get the Reader's Edition, which has only the words. And then if you look up Jung's Red Book images, you can see most of the images from the Red Book. Okay, so I am V meta. Yes, it could, but the quote, write what you know, and quote, take it as you will, quote, could be strung together. My truth is your myth. Grenade says, does it come with the visuals that were in the original book? The Reader's Edition does not. Those are important to me, haha. Yes, you need to look for them through the internet. They are available online, but their context might not be clear because they're not in the right places in the reading. So I'm carrying on now with Dr. Arzt's essay. I'm reading today from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arzt. This is volume 1, and this is Thomas Arzt's essay, which is the very first essay in the series. Initially, Jung wrote down his fantasies and active imaginations in the so-called black books, which are regarded as his personal protocol. Oh, I read that, I guess. Okay, so at the end of that paragraph, though, it says, in Sono Shamdasani's summary view, the Red Book presents, quote, a series of active imaginations together with Jung's attempt to understand their significance. This work of understanding encompasses a number of interlinked threads, an attempt to understand himself and to integrate the and develop the various components of his personality, an attempt to understand the structure of the human personality in general, an attempt to understand the relation of the individual to present-day society and to the community of the dead, an attempt to understand the psychological and an attempt to understand the psychological and historical effects of Christianity, and an attempt to grasp the future religious development of the West. Jung discusses many other themes in the work, including the nature of self-knowledge, the nature of the soul, the relations of thinking and feeling and the psychological types, the relation of inner and outer masculinity and femininity, the uniting of opposites, solitude, the value of scholarship and learning, the status of science, the significance of symbols and how they are understood, the meaning of the war, madness, divine madness, and psychiatry, how the imitation of Christ is to be understood today, the death of God, the historical significance of Nietzsche, and the relation of magic and reason, unquote. Wolfgang Geigerich argues that the Red Book is to be read as Jung's answer to Nietzsche. Like many of his generation, Jung tried to confront the implications of modernity head-on. Here, by the way, one may be reminded of Heidegger's and Junger's disputation over the line, in which both, with respect to the question of nihilism, navigate in Nietzsche's wake. But Jung did not see his solution represented in Nietzsche's Übermensch. But Jung did not see his solution represented in Nietzsche's Übermensch. It was rather in the formulation of a new spirituality. The title of this solution is The Process of Individuation. Quote, the overall theme of the book is how Jung regains his soul and overcomes the contemporary malaise of spiritual alienation. This is ultimately achieved through enabling the rebirth of a new image of God in his soul and developing a new worldview on the form of a psychological and theological cosmology. Liber Novus presents the prototype of Jung's conception of the individuation process, which he held to be the universal form of individual psychological development. Liber Novus itself can be understood on one hand as depicting Jung's individuation process. My lungs don't hold enough air anymore to read some of these sentences anyway. Liber Novus itself can be understood on one hand as Liber Novus itself can be understood on one hand as depicting Jung's individuation process, and on the other hand as his elaboration of this concept as a general psychological schema, unquote. Along with Jung's narrative of individuation, many philosophical, theological, and psychological questions concerning topics such as God, knowledge, language, logic, meaning, chaos, death, and evil are raised in the Red Book. Several distinct themes and concepts circumscribing Jung's attempt at conceiving a new Several distinct themes and concepts circumscribe Jung's attempt at conceiving a new cosmology. Among others, these are 1. Finding the soul. At the beginning of his self-experiment, Jung is instructed by the spirit of the depths to turn away from the spirit of this time, which represents the scientific, materialistic worldview, and follow the spirit of the depths, which is the ruler of the depths of world affairs from time immemorial, and for all the futures possesses a greater power, than the spirit of this time, who changes with the generations. The soul should not be considered as an object of science, an object of a dead system or a dead formula, but rather as a living and self-existing being. The path to the soul is but rather as a living and self-existing being. The path to the soul is difficult and fraught with danger, for the signposts have fallen, unblazed trails lie before us. For the signposts have fallen, unblazed trails lie before us. May each go his own way. Further, quote, "My friends, it is wise to nourish the soul. Otherwise, you will breed dragons and devils in your heart," unquote. The Red Book documents Jung's journey to the rediscovery of his lost soul, as well as his method of active imagination used to enter into dialogue with what he discovers. Soul and the experience of God. The view that the soul is a place for the experience of God permeates the entire Red Book. I am ignorant of your mystery. Quote, "I am ignorant of your mystery. Forgive me if I speak as in a dream, like a drunkard. Are you God?" Unquote. In Jung's encounter with the soul, God does not reveal himself as the God does not reveal himself as the, quote, God of theologians, unquote, who is dead and in need of renewal. But in the overwhelming experiences of paradoxical dichotomies found within, for example, the, quote, God yet to come, unquote, is the, quote, melting together of sense and nonsense, unquote, in the, quote, supreme meaning, unquote, and, quote, as day requires night and night requires day, so meaning requires absurdity and absurdity requires meaning, unquote. This divine encompasses meaning and absurdity, the greatest and the smallest. The supreme meaning is great and small. It is as wide as the space of the star. It is as wide as the space of the starry heaven, and as narrow as the cell of the living body. The new God is a coincident. The new God is a coincidentia oppositorum, and God's birth takes place in the inner world. I saw a new God, a child. The God holds the separate principles in his power. He unites them. The God develops through the union of the principles in me. He is their union. Viewed in a broader context of Western intellectual history, Nietzsche at the end of the 19th century proclaims the death of God, while Jung in Liber Novus presents the rebirth of God at the beginning of the 20th century. Let's see. Student of Rhythm says, I got the reader's edition, and while somewhat disappointed at the lack of pictures, it was good to just have the text to hold my attention. Plenty, oh, but plenty in that alone. Jonathan Cabral ordered my Red Book last week, getting it tomorrow. Can't wait to delve in. Thanks, Skip, for bringing this to the forefront to so many people. Okay, so in this next section, which is called the Renewal of the God Image, I'm just going to take a sip of water as I'm reading here. We still have quite a few pages to go. Okay, in this next section, which is called the Renewal of the God Image, I wrote in the margin, key. Okay, so at least when I read this essay the first time, I thought this was key. And the quote that I'll be reading is a dialogue between a psychogenic figure, Izdubar, who's a mythical figure, and I being Jung. Renewal of the God image. A key to Jung's oeuvre can be found in the encounter with the wounded mythical figure Izdubar, whom Jung would like to heal. Like modern man, Izdubar becomes paralyzed by the poison that is science because, quote, this awful magic, unquote, only leaves words in place of gods. Science has destroyed the capacity of belief. Quote, Izdubar. But this science is the awful magic that has lamed me. How can it be that you are still alive even though you drink from this poison every day? Unquote. We've grown accustomed to this over time because men get used to everything, but we're still somewhat lamed. On the other hand, this science also has great advantages, as you've seen. What we've lost in terms of force, we've rediscovered many times through mastering the force of nature. Izdubar. Now you perhaps see that we had no choice. We had to swallow the poison of science. Oh, I'm sorry. That isn't Izdubar. That's Jung again. Okay, so the next paragraph is I. Now you perhaps see that we had no choice. We had to swallow the poison of science. Otherwise, we would have met the same fate as you have. We'd be completely lamed. If we encountered it unsuspecting, we'd be completely lamed if we encountered it unsuspecting and unprepared. This poison is so insurmountably strong that everyone, even the strongest and even the eternal gods, perish because of it. If our life is dear to us, we prefer to sacrifice a piece of our life force rather than abandon ourselves to certain death, unquote. Jung knows that he has to stand by the side of the lame and ill Izdubar, who is his brother, to cure him. After squeezing Izdubar into the size of an egg and putting him in his pocket, Jung succeeds in healing and transforming him, thus leading to a rebirth of mythic sensibility. In the teaching of the Red Book, man embodies the gateway through which crowds the train of the gods and the coming and passing of all times. With Izdubar's rebirth, an understanding of soul, self, and God becomes visible, which Jung would much later formulate in Answer to Job as the desire of God to continuously incarnate. But already in his Red Book, this finds expression as follows, quote, just as the disciples of Christ recognized that God had become flesh and lived among them as a man, we now recognize that the anointed of this time is a God who does not appear in the flesh. He is no man, and yet is a son of man, but in spirit and not in flesh. Hence he can be born only through the spirit of men as the conceiving womb of God, unquote. Jung's new God, therefore, is a pneumatic God, as Jung elaborates in a letter to Joan Corey on February 29, 1919. Quote, "The primordial creator of the world, the blind creative libido, becomes transformed in man through individuation, and out of this process, which is like pregnancy, arises a divine child, a reborn God, no more longer dispersed into the millions of creatures, but being one and this individual, and at the same time all individuals, the same in you as in me." Dr. Long has a little book, 7 Sermons ad Mortuus. There you find the description of the Creator dispersed into his creations, and in the last sermon you find the beginning of individuation, out of which the divine child arises. The child is a new God, actually born in many individuals, but they don't know it. He is a spiritual God, a spirit in many people, yet one and the same everywhere. Keep to your time and you will experience his qualities, unquote. MD says, Godchild of Synthenesia, bring back infinite power from this cryogenic plane, burn all the dead wood from the symbolic imaginary real. Okay. I can't say as I quite understand your point there, MD, but whatever. I'm sorry. How much longer do we have to go here? Okay, we have about 10 more pages to read. I may be able to get it done in the 2 hours. Imitatio Christi. With the Red Book identifying the individuation process as the royal road to rediscovering soul and God, Jung revises the traditional Christian teaching of Imitatio Christi. Simply being a devout Christian does not suffice anymore. Instead, the new form of spirituality requires searching for the inner Christ, who stands for the sacrifice and willingness needed to take one's own life into one's own hands, while staying faithful to one's essence and one's love. As opposed to remaining in an infantile attitude of imitation, the individual is asked to find a place for Christ in his heart and then follow his independent path during a process of personal growth, living his own life just as Christ lived his. The new God laughs at imitation and discipleship. He needs no imitators and no pupils. In addition to the individual dimension, an eschatological one is of relevance as well when Jung writes, quote, "I believe you have completed your work, since the one who has given his life, his entire truth, all his love, his entire soul, has completed his work. The time has come when each must do his own work of redemption. Mankind has grown older, and a new month has begun." Unquote. In Jung's later writings, such as Mysterium Conjunctionis and Ion, the symbol of Christ is a symbol of the self. The symbol of Christ as a symbol of the self will play a significant role. The union of opposites. The theme of the unification of opposites is a central motif of the Red Book, and, like the symbol of Christ, is further elaborated in Jung's later works. This theme deals with the recognition of the neglected and ignored aspects of the psyche, as well as with the consideration of the opposite as the missing half of wholeness. You begin to have a presentment of the whole when you embrace your opposite principle, since the whole belongs to both principles, which grow from one root. The psychological formulation of the problem of opposites is regarded by Jung himself as a renewal. The Red Book, numerous pairs of opposites are found. In the Red Book, numerous pairs of opposites are found. Sense and nonsense, fullness and void, creation and destruction, love and hate, spirit and matter, insanity and sanity, above and below, order and chaos. Phases of psychic order are succeeded by phases of psychic chaos that defy any form of rationality or control while still being the conditio sine qua non of the transformative mystery that is individuation. Quote, "We recognize that the world comprises reason and unreason, and we also understood that our way needs not only reason, but also unreason. But one can be certain that the greater part of the world eludes our understanding. We must value the incomprehensible and unreasonable equally, although they are not necessarily equal in themselves." I'll start that sentence again. We must value the incomprehensible and unreasonable equally, although they are not necessarily equal in themselves. A part of the incomprehensible, however, is only presently incomprehensible and might already concur with reason tomorrow. But as long as one does not understand it, it remains unreasonable. Insofar as the incomprehensible accords with reason, one may try to think it with success, but insofar as it is unreasonable, one needs magical practices to open it up. If one has done one's best to steer the chariot, and one then notices that a greater other is actually steering it, then magical operation takes place. But the condition is that one totally accepts it and does not reject it in order to transform everything to the growth of the tree. In order to transfer everything to the growth of the tree, unquote. The basic issue, writes Shamdasani, was how the problem of the opposites could be resolved through the production of the uniting or reconciling symbol. This forms one of the central themes of Liber Novus. Both poles of each pair of opposites, good and bad, spirit and matter, reason and unreason, etc., are to be acknowledged in life in order to gain a holistic worldview during the mysterious process of individuation. The world is a painting of opposites, Jung's perspective. The world is a painting of opposites. Jung's perspective here, first and foremost, draws on Heraclitus and Nicholas Cusanus. Together with the principles of enantiodromia and the transcendent function, the concept of opposites and the unification of opposites represent the foundation of Jung's later elaborations in analytical psychology. Now, I'll just say as an aside here that for Americans who are troubled by the current political situation, regardless of which side you may now be on, if you try to accept the idea that the opposite is also within you, and then try to understand the United States, or the idea of the United States, or take a symbol like the flag as a combination of both of those opposites, then you start to see what Dr. Jung is talking about in individuation. That's just my personal homily. The Grenade says, the tree of life, our family tree. Quite so. Okay, going on. The coming eon. Jung strikes a prophetic tone in his Red Book. However, despite being certain that it is an important work of revelatory character, eventually to gain a broader audience for its visionary elements, he does not see himself as a prophet. Quote, I will be no savior, no lawgiver, no master teacher unto you. You are no longer little children. Unquote. Upon further review, Jung's first picture at the beginning of the chapter, The Way of What Is to Come, does hint at his notion of thinking in astronomic and astrological terms. His narrative of the individuation process directly corresponds to the insight that the Christian age, the Piscean age, is coming to an end and that mankind is standing at the doorstep of a new age, the Aquarian age. Humanity is experiencing birth pains since a new image of God is unfolding. The Red Book is a highly complex and indeed an enormous volume and anything but light reading. It does not offer itself for a quick skim, but rather it grows in substance for the persistent, as with homeopathic doses and small bites. Although amenable to manifold perspectives and interpretations, it already is certain that the Red Book is going to call for a new view of Jung's life and oeuvre. Furthermore, one can confidently presume that Jung's rank in the intellectual history of the 20th century must be reevaluated, since his searching for his own myth comes at an epochal turning point in human history and the history of human consciousness. In this sense, the Red Book serves as a document of Jung's discovery of his very personal myth, life as the unfolding of the individuation process, that simultaneously represents an account of the conditions necessary for the development of a much-needed new collective myth. But differently in the form of a thesis here, Jung's personal individuation process could resemble Lyotard's Petit Récit, whereas the new myth of a collective individuation process has the potential to be Lyotard's Grand Récit, or grand narrative. In a late letter to Sir Herbert Reed, dated 2 September 1960, Jung writes, quote, The great problem of our time is that we don't understand what is happening to the world. We are confronted with the darkness of our soul, the unconscious. It sends up its dark and unrecognizable urges. It hollows out and hacks up the shapes of our culture and its historical dominance. We have no dominance anymore. They are in the future. Our values are shifting. Everything loses its certainty. Even sanctissima causalitas has descended from the throne of the axioma and has become a mere field of probability. Who is the awe-inspiring guest who knocks at our door portentously? Fear precedes him, showing that ultimate values already flow towards him. Our hitherto believed values decay accordingly, and our only certainty is that the new world will be something different from what we are used to. Unquote. It seems as if postmodern sensitivities, perplexities, and intuitions are already shimmering through in this letter. Similarly, in the midst of Similarly, in the midst of Western spiritual and philosophical atony, following the collapse of Occidental metaphysics and political master ideologies, Jean-François Lyotard came to the philosophical realization that postmodernity does not offer a meaning-endowed and integrative meta-narrative anymore. After the end of modernity, he could find no grand narrative to provide people with an all-encompassing explanation for their position in the world. From today's point of view, one may argue that on the psychological level, the Red Book, with its prototype of the concept of the individuation process, qualifies as a model for the development of a new collective myth in postmodern society. The Red Book encourages the discovery of the cosmos, of the inner world, and in it the birth of a new God. With the help of the insights provided by Jungian psychology, one is aided in the development of one's own personal myth and in the rediscovery of the soul. Graf Durkheim's fundamental maxim of, quote, daily life is spiritual exercise, unquote, might serve as a trail marker to be followed on this path. Quote, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God, unquote. In his self-experiment, Jung not only found his own myth, but also the new God and a new religion about which he would remain silent for decades to come. The Red Book was made accessible only to some selected few of Jung's family and his inner circle, and for years it was kept private in his personal library. In retrospect, the experiences of the years 1912 through 1928 eventually turned into the foundation of analytical psychology, as Jung would write at the end of his life in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Quote, it has taken me virtually 45 years to distill within the vessel of my scientific work the things I experienced and wrote down at that time. As a young man, as you see, this touches me very deeply, and I'll explain why at the end of my reading here. As a young man, my goal had been to accomplish something in my science, but then I hit upon this stream of lava, and the heat of its fires reshaped my life. That was the primal stuff which compelled me to work upon it, and my works are a more or less successful endeavor to incorporate their incandescent matter into the contemporary picture of the world. The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important of my life. In them, everything essential was decided. It all began then. The later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from the unconscious, and it first swamped me. It was the prima materia. It was the prima materia for a lifetime's work, unquote. MD says, this reminds me of the Kabbalion and the Holy Bible, MD. And Grenade says, indeed, the principle of polarity embodies the idea that everything is dual, everything has two poles, and everything has its opposite. All manifest things have two sides, two aspects, or two poles. Everything is and isn't at the same time. All truths are but half-truths, and every truth is half false. There are two sides to everything. Opposites are identical in nature, yet different in degree. Extremes meet, and all paradoxes may be reconciled. From the Kybalion. And then he says prima materia from Philemon. Okay. Carrying on. Although the Red Book was somehow intended for future readership, Jung was hesitant regarding its publication. Not until his near-death experience in 1944 and the visions witnessed there did the decision come to elaborate on his dialogue with the soul in his publication, Ion. Quote, "Before my illness in 1944, I have often asked myself if I were permitted to publish or even to speak of my secret knowledge. I later set it all down in Ion. I realized that it was my duty to communicate these thoughts, yet I doubted whether I was allowed to give expression to them. During my illness, I received confirmation, and I now knew that everything had meaning and that everything was perfect." Unquote. Ion, therefore, can be read as Jung's commentary on his experiences put down in his Red Book. And just as an aside, as many of you know, we're running an advanced seminar on Ion for the advanced reading group, and you may be interested in joining it. Yesterday was our 17th session, so there are 17 videos of the first 9 chapters of Ion already available. And next Wednesday at 1:30, I'll be conducting session number 18. Jung's initial painting in Liber Novus, found at the beginning of the first chapter, The Way of What Is to Come, illustrates the secret knowledge. After about 2150 years, the Christian eon, the Piscean age, is nearing its end. Humanity is now facing an epochal period of transition, the dawning of a new age. A closer examination of the painting on the first page of Liber Novus discloses Jung's view of the universe and of man's journey through time. In the middle of the picture, an old ship is ready to set sail. A medieval town is present in the background. Underneath the water's surface, inhabitants of the ocean's depth are discernible. Below them lies the fiery, fluid basalt of the Earth's volcanic interior. At the top of the painting, a four-rayed sun is seen in the heavens, traveling on its ecliptic path through zodiacal signs. In Jung's illustration, the sun is positioned between the signs of Pisces and Aquarius, while one of the 4 rays reaches onward to the astrological sign of Aquarius, the coming age. Jung is here clearly referring to the astronomical phenomenon of the zodiacal precession of the equinoxes. Approximately every 2150 years, a period known as a Platonic month, this astronomical precession causes a gradual shifting of the vernal equinox into the preceding sign of the zodiac. In the late Hellenistic age, it was calculated that the equinox would move or precess through the entire circle of the 12 zodiacal constellations over a period of roughly 25,800 years. This period came to be called a Platonic month. Recently, the International Astronomical Union calculated that the precession through the entire zodiac takes exactly 25,771.58 years. At the last turn of the times, which occurred around 200 BC, which occurred around 200 BCE, the vernal equinox transitioned from Aries into Pisces. This was the beginning of the Piscean age. Now, over 2 millennia later, we have arrived at the end of the Piscean age. Looking at these astronomical phenomena with an acausal synchronistic approach, Jung saw that humanity is on the threshold of a new age, the Aquarian age. Within this difficult phase of eonal transition, immense difficulties can be expected. Jung perceived that these epochal transitions between Platonic months go hand in hand with a metamorphosis of the gods. The period of transition between eons is therefore always accompanied by pronounced anxiety, confusion, and melancholia. Quote, "My thoughts about this world were not and are not enjoyable. The drive of the unconscious toward mass murder on a global scale is not exactly a cheering prospect. Transitions between the eons always seem to have been melancholy and despairing times, as for instance the collapse of the old kingdom of Egypt. In Egypt between Taurus and Aries, or the melancholy of the Augustinian age between Aries and Pisces. And now we are moving into Aquarius, and we are only at the beginning of this apocalyptic development. Already I am great-grandfather twice over and see those distant generations growing up who long after we are gone will spend their lives in that darkness. The development, with its seemingly nihilistic trend toward disintegration, must be understood as the symptom and symbol of a mood of universal destruction and renewal that has set its mark on our age. This mood makes itself felt everywhere, politically, socially, and philosophically. We are living in what the Greeks called the right moment. We are living in what the Greeks called the kairos, the right moment, for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols. This peculiarity of our time, which is certainly not of our conscious choosing, is the expression of the unconscious man within us who is changing. Coming generations will have to take account of this momentous transformation of humanity. Coming generations will have to take account of this momentous transformation if humanity is not to destroy itself through the might of its own technology and science." Unquote. The Christian age is coming to an end, and we are witness to this epochal turning point in human consciousness. The New Age, the way of what is to come, corresponds with the formulation of a new image of God. Jung's outlook points to the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, who, quote, is the spirit of physical and spiritual procreation, who from now on shall make his abode in creaturely man. The future indwelling of the Holy Ghost in man amounts to a continuing incarnation of God. It is the task of the Paraclete, the Spirit of Truth, to dwell and work in individual human beings so as to remind them of Christ's teachings and lead them into the light, unquote. Thereby, the incarnatio continua, the continuing incarnation of the Holy Spirit in mortal man, becomes the signature of a new spirituality in the coming eon. Quote, we are still looking back at the Pentecostal events in a dazed way instead of looking forward to the goal the Spirit is leading us to. Therefore, mankind is wholly unprepared for the things to come. Man is compelled by divine forces to go forward to increasing consciousness. Man is compelled by divine forces to go forward to increasing consciousness and cognition, developing further and further away from his religious background because he does not understand it anymore. His religious teachers and leaders are still hypnotized by the beginnings of a then new eon of consciousness instead of understanding them and their implications. What one once called the Holy Ghost is an impelling force, creating wider consciousness and responsibility, and thus enriched cognition. The real history of the world seems to be the progressive incarnation of the deity. The real history of the world seems to be the progressive incarnation of the deity, unquote. And just as an aside, this was in a letter to the Reverend Morton T. Kelsey on 3 May 1958. And it's one of the letters that I have read into the playlist on this channel called Blunt Psychiatrist versus Theologians. Okay, there's a discussion on the zodiac, which I'm going to leave out for now. I'm running tight on time, and I still have 4 pages to read. The Age of the Holy Ghost. It certainly would be a worthwhile endeavor to inquire as to the degree of influence the Calabrian abbot Joachim of Fiore may have had on Jung's writings. With his theory of 3 ages, Fiore's eschatological outlook had a significant influence on the Western history of ideas. In a letter, Jung himself directly refers to the Age of the Holy Ghost. Quote, the later development from the Christian eon to the one of the Spiritus has been called the Evangelium Aeternum by Giacchino da Fiore, in a time when the great tearing apart had just begun. Such vision seems to be granted by divine grace as a sort of consolation. Such vision seems to be granted by divine grace as a sort of this is in Latin, but I'm going to read it in English. It has too many syllables in Latin. Such vision seems to be granted by divine grace as a sort of consolation, so that man is not left in a completely hopeless state during the time of darkness. We are actually in the state of darkness viewed from the standpoint of history. We are still within the Christian eon and just beginning to realize the age of darkness, where we shall need Christian virtues to the utmost, unquote. That was from a letter to Victor White dated November 24th, 1953. And taking Jung's remark further, Edinger notes in his Ion Lectures, quote, as it gradually dawns on people one by one that the transformation of God is not just an interesting idea, but is a living reality, it may begin to function as a new myth. Whoever recognizes this myth as his own personal reality will put his life in the service of this process. Such an individual offers himself as a vessel for the incarnation of deity, and thereby promotes the ongoing transformation of God by giving him human manifestation. Such an individual will experience his life as meaningful and will be an example of Jung's statement, quote, "The indwelling of the Holy Ghost, the third divine person, in man brings about the Christification of many," unquote. That last quote within Edinger's quote is within the last paragraph of Answer to Job. The individuation process in psychological terms resembles the indwelling of the Holy Ghost in the vessel of the individual. Jung did not only inscribe his own myth in his Red Book, but additionally formulated a new narrative, the process of individuation of man and mankind, which could be the special value of Jung's Red Book for our time, since this new narrative can be considered an antidote to Lyotard's analysis of our epoch, inasmuch as Jung's life work lays out the cure of the current spiritual malaise. What is left as our task of tasks for those who can sense and thus subscribe to the loss of spiritual substance within the contingencies of a postmodernity turned chaotic. In seeking to assist a patient in finding a way to her individuation process and the rediscovery of soul, Jung recommended creating a personal Red Book. Quote, "I should advise you to put it all down as beautifully as you can in some beautifully bound book. It will seem as if you were making the visions banal, but then you need to do that. Then you are freed from the power of them. If you do that with these eyes, for instance, they will cease to draw you. You should never try to make the visions come again. Think of it in your imagination and try to paint it. Then, when these things are in some precious book, you can go to the book and turn over the pages, and for you, it will be your church. And for you, it will be your church, your cathedral, the silent places of your spirit where you will find renewal. If anyone tells you that it is morbid or neurotic and you listen to them, then you will lose your soul, for in that book is your soul," unquote. Your cathedral, one's own church, is an ecclesia. One's own church as an ecclesia spiritualis. This is the pressing issue today, according to Jung. We are in a period of turbulent transitions, in an interim of history. However, just how postmodern radical plurality and incarnatio continua are entangled with each other remains a mystery. Perhaps this logical contradiction is the sign of a deeper truth, even if it took centuries, as Jung suspected, before the new God image would constitute itself. The new collective myth already is delineated, and the individual consequently called upon to actively contribute to the foundation of a new religion in the form of an invisible church. As this is described in a dream and during an ensuing talk of Max Zeller, as this is described in a dream and during an ensuing talk of Max Zeller with Jung himself. Quote, "A temple of vast dimensions was in the process of being built. As far as I could see ahead, behind, right, and left, there were incredible numbers of people building on gigantic pillars. I, too, was building on a pillar. The whole building process was in its very first beginnings, but the foundation was already there. The rest of the building was starting to go up, and I and many others were working on it." Unquote. I just point out that this is almost the same vision as comes up in The Shepherd of Hermas, which was written in the 2nd century. And so I'm just referring you to that archetypal fact. Jung said, yes, you know, that is the temple we all build on. We don't know the people because, believe me, they build in India and in China and in Russia and all over the world. That is the new religion. You know how long it will take until it is built? I said, how should I know? Do you know? He said, I know. I asked how long it will take. He said, about 600 years. Where do you know this from? I asked. He said, from dreams, from other people's dreams, and from my own. This new religion will come together as far as we can see. Unquote. So where does that leave us? Sloterdijk is definitely right, of course, when he points out that no one has a grasp of the current situation with its technological titanism. We don't know what is happening to us. We are struck too deeply in the process itself to be able to see it in its totality. We are caught flying blind, so to speak. Quote, are the accelerated, energized, and interconnected complexes we are living in able to do anything but a plunge forward? He who were able to discern between walking, drifting, and plunging would have to be prophetically gifted. This is the state Heidegger hinted at when he made the remark that only a God can save us, unquote. As Heidegger himself elaborates further during his famous interview with the German newspaper Der Spiegel, quote, the only possibility available to us is that by thinking and poeticizing, we prepare a readiness for the appearance of a God, or for the absence of a God in our decline, unquote. Pointing at a previous well-known metamorphosis of the gods, Jean-Luc Nancy, a student of Jacques Derrida, states, quote, we are in the situation the Romans were in during the 6th century after Christ. They knew that something was coming to an end, antiquity. Yet the Christian Middle Ages were neither foreseeable nor conceivable, just as much as we cannot imagine what may follow our current phase of upheaval, and this is exactly what creates so much confusion, unquote. As we here have embedded the ongoing discussions of modernity, postmodernity, and post-histoire within the broader context of Jung's speculation of an epochal turn, we also believe it is safe to say that he who experiences the objective psyche, whatever it reveals, will not fall prey to the assaults of philosophical deconstruction. In addition, from Jung's point of view, even amid the catastrophe-bearing turmoil of a paradoxical globalization, and after the collapse of master narratives, we contemporaries are still left with opportunities and ways for experiencing the divine realm, new paths for mystical experience, active imagination, dreams, and myth as modes of perception that can also be found in times of postmodern nihilism. To formulate this idea more clearly, Jung's own myth points back to late antiquity, and his psychohistorical excavations finally led him to a Gnostic interpretation of the world, so that as a remedy for postmodern turbulences, it will be gnosis that represents the bridge toward what is to come. As Ernst Junger put it, quote, "We receive more life force than we can absorb for the time being, let alone manage. It is without specific qualities and originates out of the great depths that spread out into manifold pleroma." It is without specific qualities and originates out of the great depths that spread out into manifold phenomena, often just there where it is not suspected by prognostics. Where it is not suspected by prognostics or utopianism, it can only be answered and contained from equal depths. Man lives in two worlds. Man lives in two worlds. So that is the end of that essay. And it has taken just over 2 hours to read it. I just make a couple of comments, personal comments. In 1993, I had an overwhelming experience that involved conversations with psychogenic entities, very similar to those that Dr. Jung had. I mean, my experiences with them were completely different, but the active imagination of interacting with those entities was very much like the interactions that Dr. Jung had. And that evolved as a novel. And that novel contained significant opposites within it, including some parts which were, putting it in a nice way, erotic. And I was in the middle of my business career when that happened. And so I put that novel in my drawer for 21 years. And it is still under my pen name, David Gerritsen, but I now have published it in 2014 under the name Mako, Memoirs of a Woman. And I consider it the autobiography of my anima up until that time, or for the period from 1962 to 1993 at least. But I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what it meant, etc. And in 1998, I also had a psychogenic experience, which many of you know of, which involved Mephistopheles as I imagined him from Faust. And I didn't know what that meant either. And so when the Red Book was published 11 years later, I suddenly understood that Dr. Jung had an experience very similar to mine, and I found that a great relief. And so if any of you have had psychogenic experiences, you definitely ought to read Dr. Jung's Red Book to see what this giant of 20th century psychology, and going forward, I think even more so, what his experiences were and how they fit into your life. Obviously, I have been taken over. I mean, Dr. Jung said that there was a daemon in him that forced him to write his books. And this presentation is the 725th video that I've put on this YouTube channel. So obviously, at least a part of that daemon that Dr. Jung had has inhabited me, and I've studied Dr. Jung's work since 1987, so 31 years. And I think it's quite important, and we all need to think about what that means to us. And Grenade says, I've had experiences like that too. I think many people have. Student of rhythm, I would simply say to you that I don't do this for selling my books. So I've published 4 books, 2 under my pen name, David Gerritsen, and all of them are available in the Dropbox for the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. And so if you are interested in reading and you don't, if you are interested in reading, you can get an electronic copy of any of my books through that Dropbox. Just send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com and I will add you to the Dropbox. Lagover says, I've had some meaningful experiences that are difficult to communicate to most contemporaries, but reading the Red Book has also mirrored many things, and I've been reading it a lot the past weeks. And I would urge you, by the way, then to read both of these volumes that have been published, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. What I have read today is only the first of 36 essays, which have already been published. And what I've done is I've read Thomas Arzt's essay, which is the first essay in the series. When I read it the first time, I thought it was profound. And I have separately read parts of it in conjunction with reading the Red Book itself. And in fact, the most popular video on this YouTube channel is my reading of the very first part of the Red Book. And I have not read the entire Red Book. And I have not read the entirety of these 2 volumes of this series, but you can find many of them in the playlist called The Red Book. And Grenade says, I'll never forget my entity said I asked a profound question, what day is it? And it was actually Sunday, and he said it was the 7th day, like the start of new beginnings. I consider that mere birth. Can't really put it all into words, but those are some details, so that's interesting. Okay, so I've been reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arzt, Volume 1. There is also a Volume 2 have here, which has been published. There are many profound essays in these 2 volumes. I urge you to read both books. The 3rd volume is scheduled for publication sometime later this year, perhaps by Christmas time. I'm not exactly sure, I haven't been told, but I think later this year it's due. So anyway, this has gotten to be a very long video, so I think I have to shut down so that our friends at YouTube don't truncate the beginning of it. So I will apologize for hanging up on you, and thank you all for joining me today.